When I fly, I am everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My name is Amelia Mary Earhart, and I'm the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. I was born in 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. My father was a lawyer, but also an alcoholic, and he couldn't keep jobs for too long because of that. So because of that, we had to move around a lot. I went to 6 different schools while in high school alone. While I was in school, I really liked science and sports, and I loved chemistry. In 1909, when I was 12 years old, I saw my very first airplane at the Iowa State Fair. Frankly, I wasn't impressed. It was a rusty, gross thing of wire and wood, and I was much more interested in this absurd peach basket, which I purchased for 15 cents. A few years later, in 1920, an airplane show really sparked my interest in flying. Excuse me. I took a 10-minute ride in one of the airplanes, and I knew right then and there that I had to fly, knowing full well I would die if I didn't. So I inquired about flying lessons, and a few days later, I had my first flying lessons with Nita Snook in January of 1921. Nita deemed me as a natural. So for the next 8 years or so, I flew on the weekends as a fun hobby while I worked at Denison House, which was a settlement house for immigrants, on the weekdays. One day while at work, I received a life-changing phone call. The phone call was from Captain Hilton H. Rayleigh, who asked if I wanted to fly across the Atlantic. I said yes, because if this offer was sincere, I would be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. I thought this out in the first 5 minutes, and I knew I had to go. I went because I love life and all it has to offer me, and I want every adventure and opportunity that it can give me. At first, I thought it was just a publicity stunt, because a year before, the famous Charles Lindbergh did his transatlantic flight. So the plane was a tri-motor Fokker monoplane called the Friendship. I would only be a passenger, but I was still very excited about this. The Friendship took off just before noon on June 17, 1928. The plane flew steadily through fog, clouds, and darkness throughout the night. By the time dawn rolled around, we had expected to find land and to land there. But when we looked down, all we saw was more sea. So for another 6 hours, we searched for green in a wide pool of blue. Finally, around noon, our fuel was almost exhausted, and we were exhausted from being cramped in this small plane for about 20 hours. We finally spotted land and landed in Buryport, Wales. This transatlantic flight really jump-started my aviation career and made me well known across America. So we returned to New York by ship, and we were welcomed by big, cheering fans. The media was ecstatic about me being the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Only a few articles pointed out that A, I was only a passenger, B, the flight had contributed nothing to the advancement of aviation science, and C, the whole thing was a publicity stunt done for profit. Nonetheless, I received the key to the city, amongst other things, and we went to Boston and Chicago for more ceremonies. By January of 1929, I had become the best-known woman pilot in all of America. Media deemed me Queen of the Air and America's sweetheart. I was very humbled, but I made sure to point out that I really had done nothing special. I just wanted to make the field of aviation more accessible to more women in a very male-dominated field. So the next 4 years were pretty busy for me. In November of 1929, I co-formed a women's pilots organization group called the 99s. The purpose of the club was to find more aviation jobs for females. I was a pretty big feminist of my time, although I never admitted it because back then, a feminist was just wrongly accused as being a man-hater. In February of 1931, I married my manager, George Palmer Putnam. Although I loved him, I was a very independent woman, and I didn't want him to hold me down and turn me into his housewife. So I kept my last name, and I made him promise me that if, in a year, we had found no happiness together, then we would get a divorce. A year later, on May 20th, 1932, I left Harbor Grace in my Vega plane to fly across the Atlantic Ocean again, this time alone. My husband, GP, had picked the date because it was the 5-year anniversary of when Charles Lindbergh did his famous transatlantic flight. Although the date was perfect, the weather was not. It was absolutely horrid, and it couldn't have been worse. I encountered severe storms and had horrible mechanical malfunctions, which should have killed me. First off, my tachometer broke, so I couldn't tell my speed or if I was on the right course. The welds on my manifold cracked, and exhaust flames blazed from the engine. The plane was heavy with ice, which made it spin out of my control. And I was flying so close to the ocean waves that night that I really should have become one with the fishes that night. Finally, around dawn, I spotted land and I landed in a cow meadow in Londonderry, Ireland. This transatlantic flight was huge for me. It was my rite of passage. President Hoover presented me with the National Geographic Society's gold medal for my endeavor. I was the 15th person and the first woman to receive this medal. 3,800 people saw me win this medal, and 10,000 people had applied for tickets to see me win this medal. That was absurd to me. In my thank you speech, I simply stated that I flew across the Atlantic because I wanted to, that it contributed nothing to the advancement of aviation science, and that I would be happy if my small exploit drew attention to the fact that women are flying too. Before I made long flights, I always considered death. I wrote to my husband, GP, that I was familiar with the hazards and that if I did not do a good job, it would not be because the plane or the motor are not well, nor because women cannot fly. Because I loved life so intensely, I was willing to risk it in order to enhance it. Alas, now the story for my attempted flight around the world. I had a feeling that there was one more flight in my system, and this flight around the world was it. The plan in 1937 was as follows. The course would be westward from California. 3 different pilots and navigators would accompany me at 3 different times, and I would complete the last leg of the flight by myself. In March of 1937, I completed the first leg of the flight. On March 20th, while taking off the second part of the flight, I lost control of my electroplane and completely damaged it. So it had to be returned to California to be extensively rebuilt. Because of that, we decided to postpone the flight till later in the year. And because of that, we decided to change the direction of the flight from west to east. So 4 months later, in June of 1937, Fred Noonan, who was a navigator, and I were ready to go. The new plan was to fly eastward from Miami. So we took off from Miami and we flew through Brazil to Eritrea to Indonesia to Australia to Lae, Papua New Guinea without any trouble. Lae was the last stop before crossing the Pacific Ocean to Howland Island, which was 2,556 miles away. The flight to Howland was only supposed to take 18 hours. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca started to get worried about us after 20 hours and 14 minutes with little communication from Noonan and I. They didn't know where we were because we weren't getting good bearings from each other. They received my last message, and it was, "We are on the position 156-137. Wait, listening on 6210 kilocycles. We are running north and south." My voice was shrill and breathless, and my words tumbled over each other. The Itasca responded back immediately, but we never replied back. Fred Noonan and I probably died July 3rd, 1937, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. To this day, I remain to be lost, and my death is one of the biggest mysteries of all time. I was 3 weeks shy of turning 40.